Hi, this is Daniel Kremen, and I'm going to talk today about the outlook for reform in 2026 as we sort of look ahead to the local elections and devolved elections around the country, and also about Nadhim Zahawi's defection and what to make of that from a reform perspective, possibly from a conservative perspective as well, and also a spate of defections announced on Wednesday by reform. I believe it's up to 21 councillors now have joined their reform group or founded a reform group, I'm sure, in one or two cases as of this morning. There may be more yet to come out, we don't know. But I just want to get into some of that as well, and the dynamics and what it's telling us about British politics at this point in time. This is my first video for a while, actually, on Kremen's Corner, and fittingly, I'm actually in a corner of one of my rooms in my house to deliver it. I thought that would be a nice little touch. So yeah, let's dive into some of that. First things first, where are things politically for reform at the moment? Well, if we think about the recent sort of spate of polling, reform is sort of generally speaking for most of the pollsters hovering around the high 20s to low 30s in terms of current voting intention for the Westminster general election, the next general election. One or two of the pollsters are closer to sort of the 33% mark, which is generally speaking, there's been a couple of 34%. But generally speaking, that's a pretty good position for reform. More in Common, who are one of the main stay weekly pollsters who reliably put stuff out there, they've had reform, I believe, now for the past fortnight at around 31%, and sort of bobbing around that sort of 29 to 31% for a while. Most pollsters are in and around that mark. There's one or two outliers, and it is one or two. One is YouGov, who, for various reasons, they have a particular panel base that's, very much a legacy panel base that they've had since the mid 2000s of online users who specifically get invited and have to log in to the YouGov website and, get involved in panels when they're invited to take part in next general election voting panels. They are an outlier. They've had reform sort of bobbing around 26, to 25% generally for around 6 months now, 6, 7 months. There's that saying, isn't there? The kids have 6, 7, but yeah, that does apply around 6 or 7 months. And they've got a particular way of doing things. I think it's a bit out. Lord Ashcroft, who is, of course, a Conservative peer, he's also had some polls showing reform kind of on the slide. But generally speaking, those are outliers. For the most part, reform has been sort of holding steady in the high 20s to early low 30s. And that's a good position to be in because, to be honest with you, reform prior to Christmas also went down a gear, quite understandably. You can't be in fourth, fifth gear the whole time politically. You'll burn out, you'll wear out. So, prior to Christmas, in that sort of build-up, reform is sort of bedding in, Danny Kruger, who was a really high-profile defection from the Conservatives, MP for East Wiltshire, as their new sort of head of preparedness for government, their special unit working under Zia Youssef that's going to be specifically working on building the government team and some of the strategy for constitutional and other sort of structural reforms in Whitehall. The kind of the things to make the machine work and to sort of coalesce the teams and the early priorities for change, both within Whitehall itself and in the wider quangocracy around it. These are the sort of the delivery bodies, the executive agencies, the non-departmental public bodies. Reform is building a blueprint for what it wants to do to kind of reshape the ecosystem of governance in the country. And I think quite wisely, the party was focusing a bit more on that before Christmas and on making some announcements about people who were coming on board, like James Orr. Other people have also sort of stepped forward into the reform sphere. One name to watch for the future is Emma Trumble, who's very much connected to the New Culture Forum. People like that getting involved in the party. Those were good things, but they're not the same sort of eye-catching, big media rally type events that Reform were doing across the summer during the Britain is Lawless campaign. The energy kind of went down around Christmas time, and that's quite understandable, quite normal, really. But it's going to kick up again. As we move towards February, you're going to see more and more coming out from Reform. Politically speaking, the party sees these 2026 upcoming elections as a major priority. And Reform this week, has kicked off on Monday with the unveiling of Nadhim Zahawi, who was a very long-standing fixture in the last Conservative government as an MP and then as a minister. He was in the Conservative Party for a fairly long time as well before being an MP. So he's a bit of a lifer. He kind of goes back to the 1990s. He was involved in the kind of campaigns of Geoffrey Archer for Mayor of London. This is a lifelong sort of Conservative. He was also a pretty successful guy in business. He helped co-found YouGov, the pollster I was mentioning earlier, actually. Made quite a lot of money out of that, as I understand it. It's a very successful range of sort of business ventures over time. He was, I think it was sort of after 2016 that he got onto the front benches. So, something around that time, around sort of 7-8 years in and around the kind of Conservative front bench. And he held a number of roles. That's not necessarily a great accolade, though, because there were so many frequent reshuffles in those final years as the political position of the prime minister, kind of various prime ministers became more unstable. But he served in a number of fairly high profile roles. He was party chairman for he had a brief time as education secretary. He was for I think probably about a month, maybe 5 weeks at most, I think. He was Chancellor under Boris. It wasn't a particularly distinguished sort of period for him, but he held that role, that somebody must have felt he was capable enough to do it, to put him there. And he is a smart guy, don't get me wrong, but, he was definitely a beneficiary of that sort of chaotic period. In terms of some of the roles that he kind of went on to hold and the status that he had. He has made a decision after standing down at the 2024 general election. He kind of been the MP for Stratford upon Avon for a good while. He quite wisely, I think, realised the way things were going and got out for the Conservatives. He's come out of the blue and joined Reform, and there was a big press conference on the Monday. Now, look, the other thing to mention about Nadhim is that I haven't really touched on yet in that little introduction. So he gained some notoriety with parts of the right during the pandemic period. So we're talking here 2020, 2021, into sort of early 2022 in some respects. Because remember, you have to remember that around that Christmas time they were pushing for another lockdown, and it was sort of early 2022 when things really started to kind of relax. But yeah, in that period, he was the minister who was responsible for at DHSC, Department for Health and Social Care. He was responsible for vaccine policy and vaccine rollouts and for compulsory vaccine mandate policy that they briefly were really pursuing with vigour. Now, look, I'm just going to be honest here. I don't have a problem with the last government's track record in developing and wanting to roll out the vaccines. I know there are some people who feel very strongly about that. I took the vaccines. I'm totally relaxed about that. The thing that was a concern for me was the compulsory mandatory nature of this idea of mandates for public sector workers, particularly in health and social care settings, to have to take the vaccine if they wanted to keep their jobs. And this precipitated quite a lot of people leaving, particularly the social care sector. Not in considerable numbers. We're talking in the thousands left, maybe quite high thousands, into 10,000 sort of plus range in quite a short period of time. And a lot of people felt that it was that compulsion that was driving it. Now, Nadhim was kind of very much the public face as a Minister of State for a lot of that under Matt Hancock and then under Sajid Javid. So for a lot of people, that sticks out and it it rankles, and I totally understand why people have that feeling. There were also just one or two other aspects to Nadhim's time in government that probably didn't go down that well with people. So that sort of also kind of clouded perceptions of perhaps Nadhim. Now, look, Nadhim himself would say that he was always on the right of the party, that he was always, much more aligned to the kind of the Thatcherite small state, pro-freedom, limited government kind of perspective than he was a liberal conservative, a wet, a one nation conservative, whatever you want to use those brackets. He would make that argument, and others have done so as well, who, people on the right still feel did go too much with the grain of the kind of the gradual and then not so gradual tilt towards collectivism within the Conservative Party, periodically beyond 2010 and particularly after 2015. He would not consider himself part of that, but others might. Now, Nadhim, I definitely would say when he was on the backbenches, styled himself and did articulate Thatcherite perspectives, around limited government, around the need for tax cuts, around the need to be pro-enterprise and so forth, and to be sceptical of, the newfangled thing and, large-scale state-led initiatives. Within government, you're kind of bound publicly on what you can say by the kind of the precept of collective responsibility. So, he couldn't speak out as freely as he might have liked. But, I'm personally willing to kind of take, with a smidge of faith that there might have genuinely been some Thatcherism to Nadhim. I do think so. You have to always kind of balance these things out by the fact that you're in a government, you're sharing government with others who aren't on the same wavelength as you. And he was perhaps responding to the incentives in the system with some of the kind of decisions he took. But I think there's a genuinely Thatcherite element to his political character that I don't think you can fully sort of fake. I think when we look back to what was going on during COVID, particularly around the vaccine rollout and some of the dynamics, I think a lot of these guys kind of got a little bit carried away with the technocracy, with the kind of the scientific technological establishment that was around them in the civil service and the sort of the scientific kind of advisors, tracking all of this. I think they got a little bit carried away with the sort of the new normalism and the pandemic management, and that was, regrettable that they did. Absolutely, was a pretty outspoken critic of all of that at the time, and I got some flack for that. I was a lockdown skeptic for sure, and I was definitely a skeptic of the idea of compulsory mandates in order to keep your job or to access services. I definitely felt that was wrong, and I didn't like this compulsory mask wearing business that was going on, in shops and in the NHS, for months after lockdowns were ending. I didn't like any of that, but I accept that it's 5+ years on now. We're getting on, for a long time beyond where all of this happened, and hopefully it never happens again. But hopefully some lessons might be learned by some of these people, as they reflect. But you can't kind of hold on to these grievances forever. At a certain stage, you've kind of got to move forward and work with people where they've got skills that can be useful. And that is very much the sort of the argument. This is the kind of the calculus that reform, people like Zia Youssef have articulated this actually on Dubes and Co. They've on Nadhim's defection, they've talked about, you can be absolutely purist about this and distrustful of anybody who had anything to do with the pandemic management approach that Conservatives took under Boris Johnson, and rule them out and say we want absolutely nothing to do with any of you. You can do that, but you're kind of limiting your options in terms of people who have been in government, who know some of the pitfalls, who know some of the personalities and the structures and the culture that you're going to face as a first term, reform government that's never been in power before, where most of its senior figures have never been anywhere near government before. You're going to need some insight. You're going to need a little bit of grit and experience in the background, helping you understand the kind of obstacles you're going to face. And that's the logic for bringing people like Nadhim within the tent. Now, he's not joining as a shadow minister right now. He's not being lined up, as far as I understand it, for a seat in Parliament. none of that. He's not indicated that he's, desperate to get back into Parliament. He obviously left after, I think it was sort of 14 years in the place in 2024. He's probably focusing on his business career primarily. But, people like this, they're volunteering their time to help reform prepare for government. Now, look, what Zia was saying, and I do agree with this, is you you don't forget the past. You certainly don't forget that some of the characters, probably do deserve more scrutiny over, the transparency of what they were doing, and the motivations of what they were doing. People in and around Matt Hancock's circle, in particular, his close political circle, and the man himself, perhaps, more scrutiny is probably needed of some of these people and their actions. But with somebody like Nadhim, you kind of you can forgive, but you don't necessarily have to forget. But you have to kind of be willing to kind of take help when it's offered, so long as you're confident that it's being offered in good faith and that there's not an ulterior motive to kind of, be at the heart of the reform machine or something like that. And then at the 11th hour, with a general election looming, you're going to stick a knife in the party's back. That would be pretty bad. And, so presumably, and, we're not privy to everything that's going on within reform. But, from the indication Nigel himself gave at the press conference, they've taken the time to talk to the man and sort of eyeballed him and got a sense of where he's coming from. And, they're choosing to invest their trust, their faith that he's there for the right reasons. And Nigel said if he detects anything that's wrong, that's seeming off, any sort of, attempt to kind of co-opt the party, move it in a particular direction, or to sort of set it up for stumbles, then he'll come down like a ton of bricks on either Nadhim or anybody else who's kind of behaving in that way. But I put some trust in Nigel. I think he's been around the block politically. I think he's a smart cookie. He's generally been a fairly good read of people. Now, I know in the UKIP days there were a few unholy alliances that didn't end well politically, a few defections and a few high-profile joiners that didn't work out. But for the most part, Nigel's been a pretty good judge of character. I trust the judgment of people like Richard Tice and Zia, who will have been involved in all of this. Danny Kruger as well strikes me as a level-headed guy with a lot of integrity. He's clearly in it for the right reasons. Those sort of people, I trust their judgment to a large extent. Now, nobody's infallible and they could be wrong, but I think there's reasons to have some confidence there. Now, look, what does Nadhim's defections signal? So I think it signals a growing acceptance by more sort of centre-right and Thatcherite greybeards, and you're seeing this outside of the kind of parliamentary ranks as well. You're seeing more people who've been around the block politically starting to move towards the reform tent. I think it signals in a positive way that reform is starting to be seen now as, the only realistic chance at the next general election of ousting Labour and getting a right-wing majority is likely to be not the Conservatives, reform. Speak clearly there. It's reform or bust as far as that goes. There are some people who still are kind of flogging the dead horse of a pre-election pact, or even a merger, but that's not going to happen pre-general election. And the Conservatives are off trying to reinvent themselves or at least reskin the brand, and they're going to keep doing that. But reform is, the main game in town, and there's a decisive polling lead right now over the Conservatives that is looking pretty significant and pretty damning for the Conservatives, frankly. In the position that they're in, reform are the game in town. And I think people like Nadhim, who are concerned about the direction the country is going in, he talked about this sinking feeling every morning that nothing works in Britain anymore, and even he is somebody who's comfortably well off. If he's more than comfortably well off, if he's feeling feeling nothing works and feeling kind of a sense of profound dissatisfaction and even insecurity about the state of the country, as you said, how do you think normal people are feeling? And so I think a lot of these people are sort of tapping into that feeling that, it's now or never. We either start to reverse the decline or it becomes irreversible. So a lot of them are joining reform, I think, with that in mind, and a sort of sense that they might not like every aspect of Nigel Farage's kind of political style and all of the people in and around reform. And the kind of the slightly more American style of campaigning and sort of framing political arguments. Not everybody on the British right likes that. I totally understand they don't. I'm okay with it myself. But some of these people are sort of swallowing their pride and coming into reform because they realise there's a bigger picture. There are bigger issues at stake, and I think that's welcome so long as they're here in good faith. Now, I think that it signals reform are seen, as I say, as the likely next government and as a view that you want to get in and you want to help shape the development of policy and the structures for delivery and the plans for delivery early. I think more will come, possibly current MPs. I think there'll be some peers in 2026. I think watch this space on that. Who'll start to join. I think Nigel will, at a certain stage, begin to be able to have voices, speaking for reform in the House of Lords on legislation, and that'll be another important milestone in the party's development. The other thing that's happened on Wednesday, and I believe it's the 13th today, I might be wrong, I was really pleasantly surprised again to see, they know how to sort of stage these things. I think it's at the moment, when I last counted, 21 defections today, 15 from the Conservatives in terms of councillors around the country, 5 independents, and I'm not sure if those were independents who'd previously been in other party groups and, defected away from, not defected, left. I hate that phrase defective, but if they are sort of people who were previously in other party groups or not, I haven't checked the detail. And funnily enough, and I was pretty surprised at this, I think it's up in Merseyside. It might be St Helens or somewhere in that neck of the woods. It was a Green councillor has joined Reform. Now, look, I get that. I totally understand why, particularly the Green joining is going to raise eyebrows, and people are going to say, well, are we a catch-all party now? Are we the Blairites before 1997? We're just taking anybody in now, and we're all things to all people. Look, I understand that there is that fear of being the Tories 2.0. And there are, very, very thoughtful people on the right, who are concerned about that reform loses some of its, and it's not just its electoral appeal and its kind of distinction from the Conservatives and that sort of uni-party dynamic if they take too many people, all from one side of British politics, all from one party. But it's also that sort of fear that, as well as the electoral optics of this, that internally the party culture begins to change. Look, I understand all of that. Now, myself, I'm an ex-Conservative. I was in the Conservatives between off and on. I had a little bit of a break around the time when they, in the pandemic, when they were pushing the compulsory vaccine mandates for public sector workers. I wasn't affected by it, but I thought that was a red line too far. But, I was in there basically from late 2011 till just before the general election in 2024. So about 13 years off and on, a few months out, as I say. And, I think I'm not alone in saying this, that a lot of the people who are party members in Reform are ex-Conservative members or ex-Conservative voters. So this idea that we should be, furious that anybody who's ever been a Conservative MP or a councillor, they must be suspect, I think that's a bit much. Now, I totally accept also that there are, people who've never been in party politics of any strip before, even non-voters who've joined Reform, people who hadn't voted in their life. I've come across one or two of those. And I also get there are people who are like lifelong sort of UKIP, Brexit Party kind of, faithful, who feel aggrieved by some of this. I totally understand it. And, if everybody joins, if it does just reinvent as the Conservatives entirely, then that's obviously at a certain stage that does become something that's too much for people. And perhaps you do lose some of the authenticity and the original sort of magic and kind of intellectual fervour of Reform. I would understand that concern, and there might even be some truth to it. But I think on a case by case basis with some of these more high profile people that are defecting, I think there's a case for it. I think if you're talking about what I bluntly would call some of the sort of soup and spoon men, centrists in the Conservative Party, on the backbenchers who never really took a stand on pro-freedom grounds, during all of the kind of the the sins of the May and the Johnson and even the Cameron government in some respects, and the Sunak government. And if they never took a stand on any of this stuff, then I would personally say, what's the benefit really here? Unless they're really super experienced in some particular technocratic area of government, then why would we take them? If their kind of views are diametrically opposed to the political vision of reform, you certainly shouldn't take them. But even if if they look incongruous, really incongruous, then I wouldn't want to take them personally. But for the most part, you just got to be case by case, open minded on this stuff. Now, look, going forward, how is reform going to sort of approach its positioning for the local elections? Can it still consider itself the sort of the outsider party if it's got all of these people? Well, to an extent, yes, because we are a coming force, but we're no longer just sort of we're certainly not a protest party anymore, but we're no longer sort of styling ourselves as an anti-establishment populist party. We're more than that. Reform is a right of centre in my book. I know they don't like using these kind of ideological labels, a lot of people at the top, but they are a right of centre political party that is serious about the transformation of Britain, that is serious about addressing some of the big structural and cultural challenges we face in our social contract and in the Constitution, and is serious about, the bottom line for people, about the cost of living, about economic growth, about real living standards. And they want to get into power. Now, look, the biggest obvious target for a major shift in 2026 are the elections for, what is now called the Senedd. I still prefer to think of it as the Welsh Assembly personally, and that might be terribly, Anglo-Irish, I say, because my parents are Irish by ancestry, but terribly Anglo sort of view and offensive. And apologies to anybody who feels very strongly about the Senedd, but I'm just going to speak my mind on this. The Welsh Assembly elections, and I prefer that term. There is a big opportunity for reform there to do really well. Now, whether they can go from zero to getting an outright majority is very debatable. It's challenging, but the electoral system for Wales has changed. There's a kind of a mixture of directly elected constituent seats and additional sort of members based on a proportionality model that is called the D'Hondt system. It's very common in parts of Europe. And it's probably going to be more beneficial, actually, to reform than the old electoral system for the Welsh elections. Reform can do well. Polls are kind of go back and forth on whether it's reform applied in first place there. But, Labour is looking in real trouble there, and deservedly so, given the chaos of recent years and the chilling sort of illiberalism in Wales that they've sort of presided over. But reform has got a big opportunity there, and I think they'll go for it. I think the key thing they have to do, though, is select soon a really good, high-profile, energetic leader for a Welsh Reform group. Sorry for all my my little what do I say, foibles here today. I'm just speaking off the top of my head. I'm not reading a script or anything. But anyway, for the Welsh Reform sort of group, they do need to identify somebody, and they need some talented people in and around the mix to be public faces for the campaign. And I think that will happen. But I think that's the biggest opportunity. I think they can do quite well in Scotland. I certainly don't think they're going to be displacing the SNP this time. But they can do. They can establish a firm reform voice in Scotland and potentially position themselves to do well in the general election in a couple of seats, maybe more than a couple of seats up in Scotland. It's England, though, that there's a huge opportunity with the local elections that are still planned to take place. And I know that there is a risk that some won't go ahead. There are plans for that, but I'm hoping that some will happen. I think there are signs reform will do very well again in those. It's, with reform, its political sort of outlook, though, reform is going to increasingly move away from being the sort of, bellicose, and it never was that bellicose after 2024, but, that really outspoken, anti-establishment sort of thing. It's going to be speaking much more about solutions going forward, and I think that's good. And I think it's going to be speaking much more about, specific policies. I think it's going to be less about sort of broad value statements and messaging, and much more about here's a targeted offer for the future. And that's positive evolution. I think the contract at the last general election was a good start. There was some really good detail in it, but it lacked substance in some areas, and that was inevitable because the party was a lot smaller at the time. Didn't have huge resources for lots of policy staff. It was kind of a lot of it was built through the goodwill of volunteers. With a little bit of insight, specialist insight into these areas. I think going forward, Reform is in a lot stronger position, and it's interesting for the local elections. They've brought other former Conservative MPs and people who were sort of metro mayors across, like Ben Bradley, who again, is a bit of a divisive character, not everybody's cup of tea, but definitely on the right of the party. And he's now helping to kind of develop for both the existing Reform Council groups that are formed, and also some of the proto groups for where they're hoping to kind of win councils this coming May. He's kind of playing a sort of a role in helping guide the development of strategy for that. And, that's a good thing. Reform are, making strides. They're attracting people who understand local government and understand, how the system works. It's all moving forward in a good way. And there's more to come from Reform. So, my overall message to people who are worried about, is Reform losing touch with its moorings, with its ideology, is don't panic. Don't kind of get down to this thing of, well, if they take X, Y, and Z Tory, it means that they are the Tories 2.0. They're going to be the uni party. It's just not the case. Reform's leadership are taking people on a very much case by case basis. They're vetting them. There are multiple conversations. It's not just, oh, we've got an email from them, or mate down the pub has said this person's interested. Yeah, we'll take them. They're doing the homework on these people, and just have a little bit of faith in that for the moment, and let's see how things pan out. And of course, Reform will also be taking people from other walks of life. There is talk of of a high profile ex-Labour MP coming across soon. This is not all one directional traffic. There is more to Reform than that, and I think ultimately they're meritocrats. They're interested in people, the talents that people and the experience that people can bring, and that's not a bad thing. So my advice is just stay the course, and we'll be okay as a party. We'll be more than okay. We'll do well in the coming year. And we have to be ready, because there's a possibility a general election could come along a lot earlier, given the parlous state of the Labour Party, than anybody's expecting. We could be looking at going to the polls in 2027 or 2028. So there's a lot to play for. There's a lot at stake, and we have to get ready. And that means drawing on expertise and insight where we can find it. Great. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, and please do subscribe to Kremen's Corner. I'm hoping to do more of these in 2026. And yeah, thanks for watching. Cheers.